Hello everyone. On behalf of the PHRN, welcome to the Linkage Luminaries webinar series for 2022. My name's Felicity Flack and I'm the Manager of Policy and Client Services at the PHRN. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands we're meeting on today and paying my respects to elders past and present. First, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for today's speaker, please type them in the Q&A box anytime during the presentation. We'll answer as many questions as possible after the presentation. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Leon Flicker, Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Western Australia. Leon's research focuses on the major health issues of older people, including falls, depression, cognitive impairment, and healthy ageing. I'm looking forward to hearing how linked data has supported this important work. And now over to you, Leon.
And thank you, Felicity, and hello everyone out there. I'm just waiting to share my screen. Good. And okay, so I'm hoping that this will last about 45 minutes and that we'll have some question time at the end. And I'll be explaining how data linkage has helped in a lot of our studies that we've been doing over here in the West Australian Centre for Health and Ageing, and why I think it continues to be important. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting on today. And that, as Felicity said, it's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to elders past, present, and to the members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community that are meeting with us today. So this is usually when I start losing people. So this is the summary of what I'm talking about. And after this, you can probably go off and do your emails or whatever else you want to do. So I'm going to be talking about ageing in the Australian context, problems with survivorship bias and why they're so important with ageing research, and particularly problems of ageing research in diseases and conditions of advanced ageing. The lack of the control group impedes studies that just focus on very old people. I'm going to talk a lot about the Health in Men study, which is the major study that I've been involved with data linkage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about data linkage and capture, recapture techniques, which I don't understand all that well, but been working with Annette Dobson and Michael Waller and the team from the Australian Longitudinal Study of Women's Health. So this is why some of my work has become more interesting over the years, and that's because life expectancy in Australia and many parts of the world is increasing. And you can see that the baby boy born in 2018 could expect to live to 81 years and a girl to 85 years. And this had dramatically increased since the end of the 19th century. Also, rather interestingly, is that the gap between males and females seems to be decreasing over the years. And that's because males are catching up. Women are still living longer, but men are starting to live a bit more than they used to. And we shouldn't take this increase in life expectancy as inevitable. It actually has stalled recently because of COVID, but even before that period, we could see that some countries in the world, and including high-income countries like the US, don't do so well. And in fact, the US has stalled completely, and the UK is starting to stall as well as far as life expectancy. And that's not universal. That's not just for all high-income countries. That's just for a few. And there's lots of issues there that we could talk about, but it's not quite clear why. And older Australians are becoming an increasing part of the population, mainly because Australia being an immigrant country which had large immigration intakes in the immediate post-Second World War period, we've been actually under-old compared to the rest of the developed world. So we currently are we're a little bit more than this. The latest census puts us at about a little over 17% 17.5% over the age of 65. And you can see that the 65 to 84-year-old age group is expected to increase by 2060, but the really dramatic increase will be in the proportion of the population that's 85 plus, and we expect it will grow from 2% to 5%. And governments have been increasingly worried and concerned about the fact that the dependency ratio is decreasing, and this is the number of people aged 15 to 64 compared to the people over the age 65. And we're now right in the middle of the dramatic decrease in that number. So you can see that compared to younger people, older people will become much more obvious and a higher proportion. Of course, the overall dependency ratio also includes children, and children are becoming much less apparent. So some of the trade-off is that there'll be less children to look after, but there'll be more older people, which some of whom may need looking after. So there isn't quite as doom and gloom as some people try to make it. This, for example, causes a decrease in the amount of money that's expected to be expended on education because there'll be less younger people around. Health will continue to increase, but only a small proportion of that is due to aging of the population. But aged care will definitely need some more expenditure over the next 40 years. And some of the things that are changing is the type of things that we experienced before death. And because people are living longer, they're much more likely to have conditions that are associated with advanced age. And the most obvious one of them is dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And you can see that it's rapidly become the second commonest cause of death in Australia. It's now the commonest cause of death in women. And about half the people who die with dementia or Alzheimer's disease die from the disease, and about half of them die with the disease. As can be demonstrated by this work from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And finally, just to round off the material about aging in general, one of the things that happens because of the aging population is you now have a burden of disease and illness is now largely caused by disability. It's become the major proportion of years lost to disability rather than to mortality. So whereas conditions like cancer and cardiovascular disease are much more likely to kill you, years life lost because of death, but you can see that the years of life lost to disability with mental illness, musculoskeletal conditions, and other conditions becomes hearing and eyesight becomes much more apparent. And so we're now in that stage where disability is now one of the major contribution to burden of disease in Australia. So that's the background. I'm going to talk about a very old study that we did 20 years ago, and it took me quite a long time to learn the lesson from this. And this was a study led by my colleague, Professor Osvaldo Almeida, who I've been working with very closely over the last 25 years. And we did this systematic review on smoking as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And this was Alzheimer's disease before the advent of the modern methods for diagnosing dementia with the amyloid and other methodologies. So this was actually clinical Alzheimer's dementia. And it was looking at the case control studies and the cohort studies. And till that point, there were a lot of people who believed that smoking actually protected you from dementia, in particular Alzheimer's disease. So, and this was based on a number of case control studies, this, for example, was an Australian study which found about 22% reduction in the risk of Alzheimer's disease compared to the control population. And there was no doubt that the people with dementia were less likely to smoke with Alzheimer's dementia. This was in contrast to the people who were thought to have vascular dementia, where there was an increased risk caused by smoking. But the cohort studies demonstrated increased risk. And now this has been confirmed in multiple cohort studies now, and it's now an accepted risk factor that smoking is associated with a heightened risk of Alzheimer's dementia, not just vascular dementia. So that was important because at the time we were still debating this, and so that was, so it's not a protective factor, but it's a risk factor. But the really important issue here is that the case control studies were biased. And even at the time, before we published this systematic review, others had been suggesting that what we were seeing is due to survivorship bias. And the people who smoked, who would have eventually developed dementia, died from other causes before they could. And this is a very subtle bias, impossible to control for. So this was, this survivorship bias was apparent in those studies. It's unpredictable, this bias, and any study that starts at the end of the aging journey may be prone to this bias. And that's why we often have the ideas of the nonagenarians and centenarians. There's this idea that we need to look at those people and work out why they're successful. But the trouble with doing those studies is, who is the control group? It's very difficult. You can't say, well, is it all the people who died first, or is it only some of the people? What do you control for? What don't you? And the idea that somehow looking at the winners can now let you determine what it is about them. And you can see that even on the anecdotal bits where people say, I only got to this age because I smoked 2 cigarettes a day, or I said I had a nip of whiskey every night before I went to bed, or they all have a belief about why they got there. But it's very hard to work out who you're going to compare those people to. Prospective studies also may be prone to differential follow-up. And this is particularly a problem of studies when you're looking at advanced old age, because as people get older, they're more likely to become disabled and die. And even some of the RCTs have been prone to this bias. So the early randomized controlled trials of tacrine with Alzheimer's disease showed marvelous effects, largely due to a lot of the people with tacrine not completing the study. So again, the people more likely to suffer side effects were more likely to get worse over time anyway, and didn't finish the study, and therefore you got differential follow-up. And so for studies focusing on the disease associated with advanced age, we need methods that are required for complete follow-up and adjustment for competing risks. And data linkage provides these answers. So now I'm just going to talk briefly about why people age. And this is the theory that's currently popular. It's not the only theory, but it's a theory that seems to have stood up at least for the last 25 years. And the first part of the theory is aging's not pre-programmed. We don't have any genetic sort of doomsday clock that turns us off at some age. What happens is that we have accumulation of somatic damage, and this accumulates due to limited investments in maintenance and repair. The accumulation of this damage is stochastic in type, and adverse gene actions may occur at older age due to genes that escape the force of natural selection, or alternatively, pleiotrophic genes, genes that do lots of things, may trade benefit at an early age against harm at older ages. So that's just a little bit about that. And now I'm going to get on to the Health in Men study. And so, and here's a photo of the investigators. The study started because of Konrad Jamrosik, who is deceased, and Paul Norman, and they had the idea of doing the randomized trial. There's Graham Hankey, neurologist and a stroke expert. There's Osvaldo Almeida a long time ago, who's a psychiatrist of old age. That's Boo Yeep, who's an endocrinologist. John Gollidge, who's a vascular surgeon located in James Cook. Susan Robinson, who's a health economist, and Chris Everton Beer. This is the study coordinator, Jill George. And these are the analysts over the years who have been involved in the study. Kieran was very much involved in the early work. Unfortunately, he also has passed away. Zoe Hyde, Janine Calver, Patrick Fitzgerald, Michelle Trevenant, Marshall McKetty, and Helman Alfonso. And this is how the study started. And it actually is, again, an example of how data linkage can be used in an important way. This is a study that was only made possible by the use of data linkage. So what happened was that in 96 to 98, a randomized controlled trial of screening for abdominal aortic aneurysms was performed. And 20,500 men were randomized to the screening group, and they were sent an invitation. About 1,100 people had died before the invitation. Invited about 19,000 men, eligible 17,000 men, and attended 12,000 men. So either 63 or 70% response fraction, depending on how you cut it. The control group were randomized, but never actually knew anything and have only been followed by linked data. So that's the first important use of the linked data in this study. We were able to have a control group that just continued on completely uninhibited by our contact, and we were able to follow them in total numbers as to particularly their cardiovascular outcomes. And throughout the entire study, we followed them, these individuals who have given consent, through the West Australian data linkage system, and that's allowed almost complete follow-up for mortality, hospital morbidity, and other things. And this is one of the forms we filled in initially, and you can see we ticked electoral roll, emergency department data, hospital morbidity data system, the mental health. We wanted silver chain and HAP, which was available at the time, mortality data, the West Australia Cancer Registry. And effectively, we've had all those data systems linked since then. Now, following that, we decided that it would be good to have a study of older men and continue the study. And so in 2001 to 4, we did some more work and we were able to invite the men. Again, 20% of the men had died in that time. The non-participants, about 35%, 11% only filled in the questionnaire, and about 35% turned up. And they also had a fasting blood sample. So we've had the initial wave 1, we had an ultrasound screening, and they filled in a very short questionnaire at that time. In wave 2, they filled in a much larger questionnaire, which allowed us to do things on cognition, depression, or quality of life, lots of other conditions. And this questionnaire was modelled on the Australian Longitudinal Study of Women's Health Older Person Questionnaire. So that's been important for what work we've done later on. Following, we've had wave 3, wave 4, wave 5. These have been largely funded by different grants. So we've had about 7 NHMRC grants that have funded the subsequent waves. And so we've now completed wave 9. We've just finished that, and we're just about to go into the field with wave 10. And there have been 270 publications, which I'm not going to share all the ones with you today, but I'm just going to share a couple of the highlights, which I think make a few points. This is another thing that I'd like to show to you, which shows what happens when you try to recruit these men at an age when they're starting to become disabled and frail. And over time, I think it's fair to say that in all studies, there has been a reduction in the response fraction. And you can see that over time, we've had a reduction in the men who have participated. Even though they know us and they've participated before, you can see that the men have reduced the number in participation and the non-responders have increased. And these are the men who are still alive but aren't able to respond. And most of them aren't able to respond because of frailty. And I'll show you that in just a moment. So what's frailty? Briefly, it's when individuals lose their physiological reserve in one or major homeostatic system such that any minor perturbation precipitates a cascade of events in multiple systems leading to illness, disability and death. And there are two competing views of frailty, a specific phenotype of frailty or another approach which is just using a stochastic model where frailty is just an accumulation of deficits. Both of those methods work, but importantly, as frailty becomes more severe, disability is almost inevitable, so that the beginning parts of frailty make it more likely that people become disabled or die in the future. We've been using a scale called the FRAIL scale. It's what we actually validated some years ago. And this is quite a simple screening tool, testing fatigue, resistance, ability to walk, number of illnesses, and a loss of weight. And this is the validation of that scale, which we did in 2010. And that was work of Zoe Hyde during her doctorate. And we showed that there was an association between the FRAIL scale at wave 2 and subsequent all-cause mortality. And after adjustment for age, BMI, medical comorbidity, smoking, frailty at wave 2 was associated with increasing odds of disability at wave 3. Zoe's paper actually on this was looking at the effect of testosterone levels on frailty and showed that higher testosterone levels are associated with a lower level of frailty. But as part of that paper, she was obliged to validate the frailty scale by one of the reviewers. There's also the frailty index, which we've also used in the HIMSS study. And this is 34 items where we're again looking at deficits and you just total them up. To get a frailty index, you just see how many of the deficits of the 34 are positive, and you divide by 34, and that gives you a number of 0 to 1. And when we look at that, you can see that most of the people are 0.1 and lower at wave 2, but there are this gamma distribution, and you can see that people, once there's a small number which would be defined as frail by having a level of 0.25 or above, and you can see that there's a small number above that. You can see that virtually nobody has a frailty index of 0.5 or above. And that's found commonly because people who have a higher frailty are almost certainly on their path to death. And that's what we also find, that the death rate increases exponentially with the frailty score. Now, this is also what we were able to do with linked data by looking at frailty. And what we can see here is that firstly, non-response as a proportion of the number of people left becomes much more important as people's frailty increases. So that you can see that the people who are in the blue and the red bars, we've actually measured their frailty. They've come back for another assessment. But on the whole, death obviously becomes much more important with increased frailty, but also non-response, so that you actually have relatively few people coming back. You'll also notice that of the people who are responding, quite a large number of them with advanced frailty have got better. And that's one of the other things that people commonly find, that people with advanced frailty either get better or die, that you don't necessarily stay in that state for a long period of time. Now, this work was performed by Kieran McCall, who unfortunately, as I've said, has passed away, but he was able to look at the imputed prevalence of frailty at wave 3 for the people who didn't come back. So this was the observed frailty during wave 3. And you can see that as the men grew older, there were still substantial numbers of people who were relatively non-frail. You can see that that's a frail scale of 0, frail scale of 1 or 2. So even for the 90 plus at wave 3, substantial numbers of the observed people actually didn't seem to be that frail. if you just looked at the numbers 3 and below, you can see that the majority of people 90 plus were in relatively low FRAIL scales. Again, you can see that with the 85 to 89. Now, we were able to look at the people who had not died, but did not return, and add them to this. And you can see we see a very different picture. The vast majority of the 90-plus-year-old people were frail. And similarly, 85 to 89, many more people were frail than was predicted from just looking at the observed prevalence. But the mortality that we found with either observed and imputed continued to have the same relationship. So we conclude that non-response may produce frailty between the imputed, and that there was little difference in the mortality risk associated with frailty between imputed and observed. But non-response may produce major bias on the prevalence of frailty as defined by either the frailty index or the FRAIL score. We found they're interchangeable as far as these analyses were concerned. But non-response does not necessarily bias the association between frailty and other outcomes, provided, of course, you can get enough people who are frail into the study. It's really important that if you're going to look at the association of frailty or other measures with mortality and disability, you have enough people who are frail at baseline. But there's probably a lot more people with greater frailty in older age groups than revealed in surveys. And commonly surveys previously never had above 70% response fraction, and now are usually well under 50%. So there's really no way of gauging what the general frailty in the population is by traditional methods. Now, I just wanted to talk a couple other things which I think are important for data linkage. Firstly, I think it's important that we understand that as people grow older, risk factors may not apply in the same way. So having data linkage doing studies, helping studies of advanced old age wouldn't be so important if we could take the information from younger age groups and apply them to older people and say they work the same way. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So I'm going to talk about, firstly, the men, women and aging study. This is quite old work from us. This was based again with the Healthy Men study, but also the older cohort from the Australian Longitudinal Study of Women's Health, led by my colleagues Annette Dobson, Julie Biles, and now Gita Mishra. Very important work, and been great collaborators for many years now. And their women were slightly different. They were same age at baseline for the men, but they were resident throughout Australia, and the response fraction was a little lower for them. But this is just looking at body mass index in men and women aged 70 to 75 and looking at total mortality. And you can see quite clearly that for both men in blue and women in red, that the nadir is in the overweight range. And so normally, if you did this study in younger people, in people under the age of 60, the nadir will be here, about 22.5, 23. And quite clearly here, overweight people have the lowest mortality risk. Now, people sometimes say that's because sick people need a bit of weight to survive, or alternatively, those people who are normal or underweight have actually got there because they were overweight before. We did lots of things trying to look at that. We looked at healthy people, healthy men and women, as against unhealthy men and women. Healthy men behave almost exactly the same as non-healthy women. Again, the nadir is definitely in the 25 to 30 range for body mass index. And you can see the unhealthy men show that, and the healthy women show that as well. We also looked at whether sedentary status made a difference. And again, you can see using normal weight women, non-sedentary as the reference mark, you can see that still overweight men and women have the lowest risk of death either in the non-sedentary or in the sedentary group. And being sedentary increased the risk of mortality in men by 28%, but doubled the risk in women, which is a very important finding. We also found that this overweight body mass index for the men decreased the risk of dementia. And so again, being overweight had the lowest risk. It seemed to be a U-shaped relationship, but definitely the NADI was in the overweight age range. And even a change in body mass, either decreasing or increasing, seemed to increase your risk of developing dementia over a 5-year period. This is another study. This is actually a pure, most of our studies have been looking at risk factors using both panel and data linkage, but this is a study using just data linkage. This is a study looking at hearing loss recorded in the data linkage system and subsequent dementia, and again finds a standard hazard ratio of dementia associated with hearing loss of about 70% increase. And this is another study again looking at the Healthy Men study. And this is a study I've brought here because this has used environmental measures. This is a study led by my colleague Jane Hayworth, who's over here. And she was able to get, firstly, observed measures of air pollution, and also she actually used the general observed through the geographical population measures, but also she actually did some studies where we actually measured some of the air pollution indices ourselves over different parts of Perth over some years. And you can see that for these older men, that the long-term exposure to air pollution did actually increase the risk of all-cause mortality and stroke. Quite low levels of air pollution, I might add. These are really, worldwide, these would be considered almost, fully clean air, because Perth is not a place of very much air pollution. Now, this is another study looking at risk factors in men over the age of 75 and looking at the predictions of cardiovascular disease, stroke and myocardial infarct. And you can see that the risk factors are quite different to younger people, younger men. Age is common, but diastolic blood pressure less than 70, highly sensitive CRP, homocysteine, and a waist to his ratio, and fair or poor self-rated health were much more important than the traditional vascular risk factors in these men over the age of 75. And this is again, just a study again, led by my colleague, Professor Yeep, and looking at telomere length. Again, it's thought that lower telomere lengths do increase the risk of death, and that is certainly found. But you can see that for the higher telomere lengths, there actually is an increased risk of a cancer death in these older men. I'm going to finish with one more study, which is being done in collaboration with the longitudinal study of women's health through Annette Dobson and Michael Waller. Karen Anstey from the University of New South Wales Aging Futures Institute's also involved in this study, as well as Osvaldo and Patrick and myself from West Australian Centre. And this is more recent work again, which is a little bit different to what we've been doing. And this is looking at administrative data sets, data linkage to determine the number of people with dementia. And as I already alluded to, the problem with doing community studies now is that we really aren't getting very good response fractions. The studies, for example, in the UK, which have traditionally had very good response fractions for detecting cognitive impairment, are now having 30% non-response. And there is definitely a bias towards more disabled and people with cognitive impairment not responding. So on that basis, we have a method that doesn't work anymore, at least in the high-income countries. For most of the high-income countries, we aren't being able to get adequate response fractions to measure cognitive impairment in older people. So can we use administrative data sets? And the most important negative about this is information bias. What's the false positives and negatives associated? So we use the Australian Longitudinal Study of Women's Health and the Health in Men study, and they had been linked to slightly different data sets. So the women for this study were linked to the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, and but also the hospital admitted patient data, the aged care data, and the self-reported survey data and mortality. For the men, we had the hospital admitted data set, the emergency department data set, the cause of death, mortality data set, the aged care systems again, the cancer registry, and the mental health systems. So we used the data source to identify people with a dementia record, and worked from Annette and Michael using capture-recapture analysis using Poisson regression to estimate the number of people with dementia who were not identified from these sources. So because we had overlap between the different sources, we knew some of the men who definitely had dementia on 2 of these different systems, but we also knew we were able to predict the men who weren't picked up by different systems, and therefore calculate how many were actually missing. And we used the follow-up period was split into separate intervals, and the capture-recapture analyses were taken for each 5-year age band, and we calculated prevalence and incidence rates. So this is what we found. So for the HIM study, firstly, there were 3,400 men who had a recorded diagnosis of dementia. And for the women, there were 3,741 people who were recorded. And these were linked to the end of 2018. And you can see, but in both men and women, the commonest way, the most frequent way of diagnosing dementia was from the aged care data sets. And you can see that the age of diagnosis in the aged care data sets was the oldest as well. So the common way of finding out the data sets, apart from, of course, the mortality, was the very oldest, but the aged care data sets was definitely one of the picking up the oldest people, obviously the most disabled and the most obvious. The self-reported data was 30% of the women and only about 10% of the men. And you can see that the hospital data sets picked up quite a lot of the men and women. So about 67% of the men and about 60% of the women. Now, this demonstrates a couple of important things. So firstly, you can see that in the men, the unidentified data was probably about 39% of the men, but was only about 19% of the women. But the other thing that's happened here, and generally it is more stable, the unidentified proportion in the women, although perhaps in the 80 to 84 years group, you can see a slight increase. But in the men, the unidentified proportion actually is going all over the place. You can see that it's going up and down, then comes up again, and is actually a fair bit higher than on the women. This just charts that, the incidence rates for both the men in blue and the women in red. And you can see that the dots are actually what the incidence rates as calculated by the linked data. And then using the unidentified cases by the capture-recapture techniques, we then chart the blue and red lines. And you can see there's a substantial move of both the women and men from the red and blue dots over to these lines. And it's particularly apparent in the oldest age groups. I think you can see that. Similarly, with the prevalence rate, you get the same issues. The blue dots and the red dots down here, the observed prevalence, and you can see the changes that would be made by using the capture-recapture techniques. And when you compare that worldwide to worldwide estimates, the capture-recapture techniques seem to be more reliable. So there's a lot of limitations in using data linkage, and the problems are the inconsistency of the estimation of the undercounting, particularly in the male cohort, and we're not quite sure why that is. There's a lack of standardization of the diagnosis of dementia, especially in aged care databases. We know this, we would like it to be better. It is something that we need to address to actually improve lots of the care and monitoring, if nothing else, but as well as using these data. Things change in the systems, and this may cause changes in the way we measure dementia. So, for example, in the aged care system, there used to be an incentive for people with dementia to have increased care funding through the Commonwealth, through the ACFI system. And so that it meant that perhaps more people were diagnosed with dementia at that time. And when that funding was removed in recent years, there may have been less numbers of people identified. So these incentives can be very important when we're trying to work out the total numbers of people with dementia and looking at the undercounting. And we need more rigor, and I haven't included here, but we've looked at the hospital systems in Perth and elsewhere, and by no means are the systems particularly good at either picking up dementia who have obvious need, or may actually overpick some people with dementia as well. That work I just mentioned I just wanted to really say that there's a lot of people all around Australia who've been involved in that, and probably a lot of the people who are listening today have been involved in that. That's involved the data linkage groups from all around Australia and the AIHW. So thank you very much for letting us do that work, and we're still only some way through it. And of course, we need to thank the men and women who've been involved in the studies for a very long time. So I'd like to conclude that firstly, it's highly likely that factors affecting healthy aging will wax and wane in importance through the life course, and I've shown you that's true for body mass index and antihypertensives, and it's likely other things would be important, telomere length, whatever. So that really we do have to do these studies in older people to be certain about what the situation is in older people. Survivorship bias and differential follow-up may be a potent cause of bias, and we're not sure which way that bias goes. So really, it's incredibly important that we have some way of looking at that. Data linkage helps ensure complete follow-up, even after people become too frail or disabled to participate in follow-up appointments or have moved to residential care. So that's a really important aspect of data linkage, which I think has been underestimated at this stage. And I think when you're looking at particularly cohorts of older people, this is an incredible issue that really needs to be addressed. And finally, as I just looking at the work in dementia, there might be opportunities to use data linkage to help monitor total numbers of people with conditions such as dementia, which is relatively hard to diagnose and is difficult to keep a registry or other materials on, and their public health impact. So I'd like to leave it there. Hopefully there are questions. No open questions? Okay.
Okay, Nicola, can you let me turn my video on? There we go, just try. No, not yet. Anyway, thank you very much, Leon. That was a fabulous tour through the many different projects you've been involved in over the years. There I am, wonderful. So we certainly have time to answer any questions that you might have for Leon. And we do in fact have one to start off with, Leon. And this is about, I think it was about the HIM study. What were the inclusion exclusion criteria to determine the ineligible? people?
So they had to be 65 to 80 years of age, and they had to be a man. They had to be able to come to the screening site. They had to have an ultrasound, so they had to be able to come to the screening site. We couldn't do that any other way. So that's really all they had. There were no other exclusions.
Okay, so it was pretty inclusive then.
Yeah.
Question from me. You mentioned a couple of times that it's become much more difficult to recruit directly from the community.
Yep.
Do you want to reflect on why you think that might be the case? What's changed?
Well, I can speculate. I don't have good data about why that is. But firstly, there's a lot more interviewing and surveying happening nowadays in the world. And this has taken off really in the last 20 to 30 years. And so you fill in anything and you get somebody asking you to be part of a survey. So I think survey fatigue is a huge issue. I think there are some privacy concerns, but I think they're relatively small. I think there's a sense, I don't think there's a sense maybe of the same altruism towards research and health research as there was, but I think generally it's not bad still, but I don't think there's quite the same degree. But I think a lot of it is survey tech fatigue now, and it's very hard for people to engage and see whether the survey is worthwhile. And I think once you actually engage people, I think they're quite happy to cooperate, but it's actually that beginning step right now.
Is it possible that older people are still a bit more resistant to digital technology and sort of online surveys? Is that off-putting for them, or that you think they're nowadays they're more savvy? Just thinking about my parents.
Well, it used to be a problem. I think it's less and less a problem with time. But remember that digital surveys, it's very hard to get good response fractions off them. I mean, they're not a great way of getting everybody. So, I mean, online, postal, whatever, telephone. And we see it in other ways, even, for example, the election results. Again, we're getting quite significant biases now in those results. And again, I think it's because people are refusing to answer.
Okay, now we've got a related question to that. So what were your data collection methods? Online, postal surveys, telephone? So
we're pretty old school. So we actually knew all these men from wave one. So we send them a letter, we send them a reminder, we ring them up, and we try and follow them. And usually for most of the non-responders, we actually have had a phone call or a letter saying so-and-so's too ill or too frail to participate anymore.
Okay, excellent. Another question from me actually is, you spoke about the one study that Jane Hayworth had worked on about air pollution and its impacts on aging. What other environmental impacts do you think might be interesting to look at? Are there other things that we think we should be looking at, how they're affecting aging?
We started looking at that with Billy Giles Corti for a while as well. I think the walkability, the idea of being able to move around your neighbourhood feeling safe and secure is a really important aspect, particularly for older people as they become more frail. I think that becomes an important area. If you're looking at the environment, we often talk about social support and those issues. We find, when we've looked at that, we find it's not really the number of people that people are entwined with, but it's actually the value that they have. It's the quality of the social network that we found with both men and women. So that seems to be more important than the actual number of contacts and so on. So those, I think, it's much more the social aspects of, safety, security, walking around, being able to do those things. That's probably, I think, the more important measures, and the ability to facilitate social contact.
Sure. Okay. Another question from online. What are the criteria used for defining sedentary and non-sedentary activities? Would these criteria differ among different age groups or occupations?
Yeah, so the people are largely, in both men and women, the people were largely retired. And so from memory, it was people who didn't basically do any incidental physical activity at all were sedentary. So we asked about minutes a day doing different physical activities. It's questionnaire based. We didn't measure it directly by pedometers or other measures. And the people who were sedentary just basically didn't do much physical activity at all, even incidental physical activity associated with household chores. Occupations much less important in these age groups because virtually all retired from paid work.
All right, next question. Are you able to talk a bit further about how results were imputed for the papers with large numbers of non-responders in the older age groups?
Yeah, not much. I did. So Kieran did the imputation analyses, and we've subsequently looked at that again. And he used basically all the available data and in particular the linked data. That was really important in the imputations. So so that was a really important part of actually doing the imputations. It's looking at the questionnaire data, and that was one of the things that I probably didn't stress enough. One of the things that was really useful is actually having both sets of data at the same time. A lot of our analyses can't be done either with just linked data or with just panel data. We need both for most of the analyses we've been looking at.
Could you elaborate on the issues with aged care databases, consent, consistency, missing data?
Okay. Yeah, so, well, all the administrative data sets, consent is assumed, right? So the data goes into the data sets. Now we have to have consent to link those data from the men, but we do have those data we have consent to link the data from the men in the future. The men at the beginning of the study never think they're going to go into residential care. Neither do the women, right? Nobody thinks they're ever going to go to residential care. Unfortunately for the Australian population, about half the women and about a third of the men will end up in residential care. So nobody ever thinks it's going to happen, but it's going to happen anyway, right? So that's an observation which you can make anywhere, right? So so the administrative data sets, the information that's acquired for administrative data sets is not basically for our purposes. The information is acquired usually for billing or some other issue. So the hospital morbidity data set, as we know, generates the ICD-10 codes, which then become part of the activity-based funding for the hospital. And they're very keen to make sure they get everything because otherwise they don't get as much money. So that's a good reason, that's a good incentive, and that's excellent that they should have that incentive to do all the ICD-10 codes. The aged care databases, unfortunately, the dementia code isn't absolutely essential for their purposes, but it's recorded quite a lot just in the general conditions. The new aged care funding instrument, I'm not sure actually will be any better, possibly worse on coding. We haven't been able to look at that yet. The other important administrative data sets, the aged care assessment program, which again has traditionally had reasonably good diagnoses, but I'm not sure whether they're trying to privatise the aged care assessment program, which hasn't been successful yet because basically it's a terrible idea, but anyway, they may keep trying. But if it does become privatised, I think the diagnostics categories may become more haphazard. Even and you can see that these diagnoses are there for other reasons, and therefore we're relying on people filling them in as much as correctly as much as possible. But the quality is always an issue. And for example, the hospital morbidity data sets, you cannot tell the types of dementia from from those data sets. Mostly it's dementia not otherwise specified is the dementia recorded. So the quality issues are quite large, and we do know when we've been looking at work that there are people missed with dementia, and there are people who are not having dementia or recorded as such. So there are issues.
Sure. And that sort of, I think, is related to this next, possibly last question about the time it takes to request and receive administrative data, and whether this makes it less desirable for researchers to use, particularly compared to, say, clinical trials. But I think you've already quite eloquently spoken about the need for all of the above types of approaches.
Yeah, look, trials answer a single question. I've done 22 trials. Look, I know about trials. They answer a single question, usually a short time period or a limited time period. It's really important in trials of older people to ensure complete follow-up. And one of the ways to make sure that virtually any clinical trial to ensure complete follow-up is through data linkage. So I actually am a great fan, obviously, of data linkage. And I think that as much as you can, you'd like it to be available for everything you do in research. The question about the time, yeah, sure, you'd want it to be done. You'd like it quicker, more available. Yeah, sure. Everyone would want it tomorrow. I'd like it tomorrow every time I request it, but it's not going to happen. Anyway.
Excellent. Okay, one last question. Do you always set out to source linked PBS data via AIHW, or do you consider seeking it via Services Australia? If the latter, were differences in the consent form requirements a determining factor?
We've done it for the Healthy Men study. We've done it through AIHW. It's in the midst of time why we did that, but I think it was very difficult to access through Services Australia. It was more difficult, and I'm not quite sure what it was, the issue then. I'm not sure if it was the consent form or whatever. It was different because, yeah, the consent from the men, some of the men who have died, the consent form was quite different from 20 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, and certainly Services Australia over the years, their requirements have changed a bit as well. Yeah. So when you're talking about a longitudinal study, that can be an issue, I think. Okay, well, I think we might leave it there. Thank you so much, Leon. That was a fabulous presentation, and you got through a lot of questions there. And we're just really grateful that you had the time to come and give the presentation.
A pleasure, and thank you for all the people who've helped out there. If any of you data linkage people, keep working, work harder.
Okay, now I just have to finish off by reminding everybody that our next Linkage Luminaries webinar, it will be on the 20th of July, and we're looking forward to hearing from Professor Leonie Siegel from the University of South Australia. So thank you to everybody who attended today, and we hope to see you all next month. Okay, goodbye.